Yes, okay. So, good afternoon. Thank you for this introduction. Today I'm going to present the Atlantic Positive Project and our experience with Vespa velutina here in Galicia, Spain. Currently, I work with one of the teams of the University of Vigo, which are participants of the Atlantic Positive Project. Let's first begin with the invasion process. This map, we already saw it in the morning, and Vespa velutina was first detected in southeast France in 2004, and from there expanded at different rates throughout Europe, reaching 11 countries until 2020. In Galicia, the first nests were found in 2012. The locations of the two detected nests were far apart, one to the north and the other to the south, a distance more than 200 kilometers between them. Both were very close to the coast, and from these 2 points, the invasion expanded into new territories, first in the coastal region, and then to the interior. By the end of 2018, the whole territory of Galicia was invaded. Okay, and during the morning, the talks of the morning, we saw this kind of maps and how is this expansion in terms of new territories invaded. But in reality, in an invasion, there are two processes occurring simultaneously: extension in area and also increasing in abundance. In the maps, we have different colors. With the darker colors, we represent density of nests with higher densities with the darker red colors. But we now see in this other plot the number of nests, how abundant was during the years this species in Galicia. Remember these three important points in terms of extension. Now we see how many nests we reported. For instance, these two first nests in 2000 at the beginning of the invasion, then this number increased in a very important dimension, arriving to more than 26,000 nests reported for Galicia. In these 2 last years, I put this in red because we are not very sure what happened, but we would like to have a decrease in population. But what I fear is that during these 2 last years, the administration responsible for monitoring and management of the invasion changed the way they managed the invasion. So what is happening here is that we don't count as so much nests because the way we monitor the population. Here we have a typical curve of population increase for an invasive alien species over time. First, we have here introduction before we can prevent its introduction, but in case it is introduced to a new region, it is very important to prevent its arrival. But then after the introduction, there is a small short window of opportunity for action and ideally eradication, and then return to prevention. In these moments are very important early detection and rapid response plans. After certain point, if we fail to achieve eradication, This will lead to an increase in the invasion in the population and leaves nothing more than to opt for containment. And after this abundance is increasing and more, we have to deal with the invasive species, and we have to develop strategies for long-term control to reduce the impacts of these invasive species. Remember, an alien species is not always considered as invasive, but when it arrives to very important abundances and when it causes impacts on biodiversity, on ecological processes, and economic aspects. And this is the case for Vespa velutina. Now let's see this data. If we overlap now the data from Galicia to this curve, we can see different phases represented by the years. From the introduction, the possibility for eradication occurred during the first 2 years. Then the possibility of containment during the next 2 or 3 years maximum here. However, that what we experienced here was that beekeepers began to be aware and lose precious time with useless methods for very little effective methods and other solutions. So we were always running behind these species. Only in 2016, we made the first scientific study about methods. The same year, we were invited to the European Parliament to present the high impacts of these invasive species, and this same year it was considered as a species of concern for the European Union. Then when with the first deceased people, citizens began to be aware of the presence and the impacts of these species. But in this year, the abundance was very, very high. It took another 3 years to achieve a common project between EU members to develop methods to control the invasion of these species. As an important note to take into account, according to a question I saw for the talks in the morning, about if we are losing money and time fighting these species in the very first part of the invasion, no, it is worth of fighting here. Eradication is only possible during this first phase. Then is only long-term control with high costs for biodiversity, money, and society. But here in Spain, not all regions experience the same fate. In the Balearic Islands, the species was detected in 2015, and taking advantage of an existing infrastructure, such as a team of experienced technicians in containment of bioinvaders, they considered it now to be eradicated from Mallorca. Some actions that began the very same year of the detection were establishment of a multidisciplinary working group, spring trapping of queens, but I have to take your attention here that traps were strategically placed and managed by technicians. Also, citizens' efforts were very, very important here. They collected data, they detected the presence of adults. They had a centralized system. They developed very quickly a centralized system to report the sightings. They made detection of nests using triangulation and a very huge effort destroying the nests. It is also important to note that it is an island. The distance to the mainland is very important, reducing the chances of natural reintroductions, and also by human transport. And they have a dry weather conditions and few fresh water courses that all these environmental conditions are very important to understand how is the rate of population growth. Next, I want to talk about the impacts of these invasive species. We saw these social insects are opportunistic and generalistic. They use many resources from the environment, such as water, fibers, to do the nest. Carbohydrates, here is one Vespa velutina drinking nectar. Here are drinking sap. And here are eating some mature fruit. They also hunt and make scavenging to gather protein. This means that these animals compete with the native fauna for all these resources, but the most important impact, for instance, for honeybees, is that adult workers are ferocious hunters of honeybees. We saw it during the lunchtime. They can gather several individuals hunting in front of the hives or in front of a colony. Most commonly, they wait for bee workers that were foraging in the field and waiting they to come, and they catch them in flight. Then they take only the thorax and fly back to the nest, bringing that pellet to feed the brood. The predation is very important since the beginning of the season, which can begin in June or July and end approximately in October, or here in Galicia in January. So these are 3 months or 6 months that in which Vespa velutina is in front of the hives throughout the whole day, hunting one after the other bees. This sustained predation pressure induces the paralysis of the colony and reduces its survivorship. We mean paralysis. This means that the bees stop foraging. They just stay into the hive and don't leave the hive, eat all resources they have gathered so far, and this can have severe consequences in the food gathering. So we have here a resume. The predation of Vespa velutina causes a reduction in number of bees, evidently, cause also stress, an increase in oxidative stress in bees, and changes in their behavior. All kinds of behaviors are changing because of the predation. This, in turn, this causes reduction in resources they have into the colony, into the hive, and changes in behavior such as defense or hygiene, that in turn redundant on the quantity of resources they have, increasing diseases, increasing mortality, and affecting the benefits for the beekeepers. Here in Galicia, beekeepers manage a number of 30% of losses in colonies and productivity, not only because the colonies die, but they have to make reposition of the colonies that die, but also because they have to give supplementary feeding. They have to take care of traps, attractant, and other devices. There is an additional time, very high additional time, not dedicated to beekeeping activities, and some beekeepers just tend to move colonies to places where Vespa velutina is not so abundant. Here we have the maps we already saw at the beginning of the invasion in Galicia. And we have here in this plot is the number of hives. These are data from the administration responsible for this. And we have 3 bars: blue, small apiaries; orange, medium apiaries; and gray, bigger apiaries. And what we see after the first years after its arrival is that small and medium apiaries had a significant decrease in the number of colonies, affecting a beekeeping sector. In 2016, we made a study comparing different types of traps and different types of baits. We wanted to study the performance of these traps as control tools. During the spring, we identified and counted all arthropods trapped in these traps. What we found is that all these traps are very effective, capturing less than 1 individual Vespa velutina per day per trap, and very low selective. Many other insects are trapped in these traps. We found also that in the forest and rural areas, the trapping is higher, as well as in the proximity to the apiaries. Here we have a scenario where we just see that the 1% of all trapping insects are Vespa velutina. This means that per each Vespa velutina we trapped in this kind of traps, 99 other individuals of other species were captured and killed. Considering these numbers, considering that Vespa velutina also hunts insects, but other groups of insects, and that the evidence shows that these traps are not really useful to reduce the population in a significant manner, we concluded that baited traps are an additional pressure on pollinators and other insects. In the next year, 2017, we made another study where we studied this device. It is called ARP. It was invented in France. It is a frame with threads, metal threads, and an electronic device send positive and negative electric signal. And when the hornet flies hunting bees in front of the hives, touches both threads and receives an electric shock, falling here in this part from which smaller insects can fly, while the Vespa velutina stays trapped in a bottle. These are the hives. So we made an experiment in 10 apiaries with each one 10 hives and 1 harp. We saw that after 5 weeks of setting this harp, the number of hornets and the number of hunted bees were significantly less, and the worker bees began to work again. There was more activity of workers after using the ARP. Another impact on the colony and the behavior of the colony is the change in the defense behaviors. Usually, colonies have no defensive or guards looking for the bees coming into the hive. That is quite normal to have some guards, but when they are under attack, they make this type of clusters. And that was what we have before using the ARP. After using the ARP, these clusters were much less, and an important, more than 70% of the colonies that were making these clusters began again to make other guards or non-defensive behaviors. These arcs were also more selective, much more selective, with the model we used in the first year were almost 70% of the captures, and last year we used also in 3 apiaries, and we get a very good selectiveness. The attractant here is only the bees fragrances and normal behavior of bees, but I have to say that the method has two important problems. The first is that there is not yet a legal regulation for these devices, and the high price and infrastructures needed, that it make it not very practical for big apiaries. Okay, as we saw in the morning, honeybees are their preferred prey, but of the huge quantity of insects that a colony of Vespa velutina hunts during the season, more than 70%, the 60% are other insects and other arthropods. And they are very smart. They hunt also pollinators in the flowers. The flowers attract pollinators, attract insects. So they use this attraction of flowers to hunt. We made an study in Mentha suaveolens, the mint, very common herb in Europe, and we studied the changes in behavior of the main pollinators group of this plant. We saw changes in different aspects of their behavior. We saw, for instance, changes, negative changes in Apis mellifera, in bombus, and small bees, and also in syrphids. That conduced to a reduction in the number of pollen deposited on the stigmas of the flowers in those plants where Vespa velutina was hunting. Thus, we concluded that the invasive hornet Vespa velutina affects pollination of these plants, so changes in abundance and behavior of floral visitors. Currently, we continue doing this work, this assessment of the impacts in collaboration with University of Exeter, studying the impacts on wild pollinators and other plants. We know also that honeybees are important pollinators of native plants, and we currently study which changes in their survivorship and behavior affect the pollination services of the plants, native and crops. Other important impacts that haven't been assessed so far are the impacts for fruit sector, both from pollination and from consumption, direct consumption of the fruits. This sector can be highly affected. Other impacts, as we saw in the last conference, in the last talk, it are the impacts on human health and public spending that must be quantified thoroughly and in a broad manner to get a better idea of what is going on in these two aspects as well. Well, as a resume here, we have some biological traits allow this species to be a very effective invasive species. The diet, sociality, type of colonies, behavior of nesting and defenses have important ecological impacts through predation and competition. Also, fruit consumption affects different primary sectors such as apiculture, agriculture, forestry, and the methods we use to control it also impact fauna and pollinators, and its defensive behavior also cause important social impacts, such as health and public spending. Finally, I'm going to present very briefly what we are working now in the Atlantic Positive Project. The main aim of our project is the conservation of Atlantic pollination services and control of the invasive species. We are 10 main partners, and another 21 associated partners, including departments of the governments, agencies, beekeeping associations, other universities and groups. And our main goal is to prevent further expansion and minimize the impact of these invasive species on ecosystems and on socioeconomic development of the Atlantic area.